$412,000. That's what my own brother's company was worth 18 months after he pushed me out of an idea I built at my kitchen table on nights I couldn't sleep, funded with money I scraped together working 2 jobs. $412,000. And for a long time, I didn't see a single cent of it. My name is Daniel. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life, my older brother Ryan was the person I trusted more than anyone else on this earth. We grew up sharing a bedroom in a 2-bedroom apartment in Ohio. He taught me to ride a bike, he covered for me when I snuck out in high school. When our dad walked out, Ryan was the one who told me it was going to be okay. And for years, I believed that if I ever needed someone in my corner, it would be him. So when I came up with an idea that I genuinely believed could change my life, a business built around a gap in the market that I had researched for over a year, there was only one person I wanted to bring in as a partner: my brother. I trusted him with the spreadsheets. I trusted him with the pitch deck. I trusted him with the supplier contacts I'd spent 8 months building. I trusted him with everything because that's what you do with family. He took every piece of it, filed paperwork behind my back, and told our suppliers, our first customers, and eventually a group of investors that the idea had always been his. They thought they got away with it. They were wrong. This is the story of how I found the paper trail my brother thought he'd buried, how I built a legal case with the help of a forensic accountant and an intellectual property attorney who doesn't lose, and how 18 months, 1 federal trade secrets claim, and 1 civil judgment later, I got back every dollar I was owed and then some. If you've ever trusted the wrong person with something you built from nothing, stay with me, because what happened in this case is exactly what should happen to people who think family loyalty is a loophole in the law. Before we go further, I want to say something plainly. This is not a story about being petty. This is not a story about revenge for the sake of revenge. This is a story about greed, betrayal, and the long, methodical process of getting every single dollar back through the legal system, the right way, with evidence, with documentation, and with people whose job it is to make sure fraud doesn't pay. If you're new here, this channel is dedicated to true financial fraud and betrayal stories, the kind where ordinary people get taken advantage of by people who were supposed to protect them. Them and how they fought back using the tools the law actually gives us. If that's the kind of story you're here for, hit subscribe because we cover a new case every single week, and some of them will make your blood boil more than this one. Now, let's go back to where this all started, because to understand how my brother was able to do what he did, you need to understand exactly how much I trusted him and exactly how he used that trust against me. In the spring of 2022, I was working as an operations manager for a regional logistics company outside Columbus, Ohio, making about $58,000 a year. It was steady work, but it wasn't the life I wanted, and I'd spent the better part of a decade watching other people build things while I clocked in and clocked out. The idea came to me almost by accident. Part of my job involved coordinating last-mile delivery for small businesses that couldn't afford their own fleet, mostly local bakeries, florists, and specialty food producers. Over and over, I heard the same complaint from these business owners. The big delivery platforms took too large a cut. The routing was inefficient for small, high-value orders, and there was no service built specifically for perishable, delicate, or highly time-sensitive goods. So I started researching. For almost a year, on nights and weekends, I built out a business plan for a specialized delivery logistics company, something narrower and more precise than the big platforms, designed specifically for small producers of perishable and fragile goods, bakeries, florists, specialty butchers, artisan cheesemakers. I called it Hearth Route. I mapped delivery zones, I interviewed 14 small business owners about what they'd actually pay for a service like this. I built a pricing model. I found 2 regional cold chain suppliers willing to give me preferred rates if I hit certain volume thresholds. By January 2023, I had a 71-page business plan, 3 letters of intent from local business owners who wanted to be founding customers, and roughly $34,000 saved up from a combination of my regular job and a weekend job I'd picked up specifically to fund this. I brought my brother Ryan into this in February 2023. Ryan was 39 at the time, and on paper, he looked like exactly the kind of partner you'd want. He had an MBA from a state university, 4 years of experience in supply chain management at a mid-sized manufacturing company, and this mattered a lot to me. He had access to about $40,000 in savings that he offered to put into the business, which would have roughly doubled our starting capital. He also had something I didn't. He was smooth. He was the kind of person who could walk into a room and make people feel like they'd known him for years. I told myself that was exactly what Hearth Route needed, someone who could handle investor conversations and supplier negotiations while I focused on operations. We had a conversation at his kitchen table in March 2023 where we agreed, verbally, that we would be 50-50 partners. I would contribute the business plan, the supplier relationships, the customer letters of intent, and roughly $34,000 in capital. He would contribute $40,000 in capital and handle the business development and investor-facing side of the company. Here is where I need to stop and flag something for you. Because if you're building anything with a partner right now, family or not, this is the single most important lesson in this entire story. We never signed anything. No partnership agreements, no operating agreements, no documentation of intellectual property ownership. Nothing that's said in writing that Hearth Route, the name, the business plan, the pricing model, the supplier relationships belong to both of us, or that I was the originator of the idea. I want to be honest with you about why. Part of it was naivety. I'd never started a business before, and I genuinely believed a handshake with my brother meant something. But part of it, if I'm being fully honest, was that every time I brought up maybe we should get something in writing, Ryan had an answer ready. Looking back now, I can see the pattern so clearly it's almost embarrassing. At the time, I explained away every single one of these. Red flag 1. When I suggested we draft a simple partnership agreement in April 2023, Ryan said, "We're brothers, Dan. If we need a lawyer to trust each other, we've already failed." I remember feeling almost guilty for having suggested it. Red flag 2. In May 2023, Ryan insisted that he should be the one to register the business entity, since he understood the paperwork better. I agreed because it seemed like a reasonable division of labor. I did not ask to see the filing. I did not check the Secretary of State's business registry. I trusted him to tell me the truth. Red flag 3, by June 2023, Ryan had started referring to Hearth Route in conversations with mutual family members as my new venture, dropping the hour. I noticed it. I even mentioned it to my wife, Claire, who told me she'd noticed it too. I brushed it off as Ryan just being Ryan, a little self-important but not malicious. Red flag 4, and this is the one that should have been unmissable. In July 2023, I asked Ryan for a copy of the LLC formation documents so I could see how our ownership percentages had been structured. He told me he'd send it over that weekend. He didn't. When I asked again 2 weeks later, he said his accountant was still finalizing the operating agreement and that there was no rush because we both know how it's split. If you are watching this and you've ever heard a business partner say some version of, "We both know how it's split," instead of just showing you the document, that is not a partner talking. That is someone buying time. In August 2023, I wired $34,000 from my personal savings account into what Ryan told me was the Hearth Route business checking account. I have the wire transfer confirmation, Wells Fargo, dated August 14th, 2023, reference number ending in 4471. That confirmation would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence in my entire case because it was concrete, time-stamped, bank-verified proof that I had funded this business as a co-owner, not as a lender, not as a gift, and not as an employee. Ryan told me he contributed his $40,000 the same week. He showed me a screenshot of a transfer, not a bank statement, a screenshot, which again, I didn't question at the time. I want you to hold on to that detail because it becomes critically important later in this story. By September 2023, Hearth Route had its first 3 pilot customers, the same bakery, florist, and specialty butcher who had signed those original letters of intent I'd secured back in early 2023. We ran our first deliveries. It worked. The idea I'd spent a year researching was actually, finally, becoming a real business. And that's exactly when my brother started cutting me out. By October 2023, I noticed Ryan was scheduling supplier calls without me. When I asked about it, he said he was just handling logistic stuff so I could focus on ops, which sounded reasonable on the surface. I was, after all, the operations person. But I started noticing that I wasn't being copied on emails to our cold chain suppliers anymore. When I asked one of our supplier contacts, a woman named Patricia at Midwest Cold Chain Solutions, whether she'd received my last email about volume pricing, she said, "Oh, I've just been coordinating with Ryan directly. He said that was easier." In November 2023, I asked to see the company's bank statements so I could reconcile our expenses against the pricing model I'd built. Ryan told me the business account was under his name for tax purposes and that he'd get me access soon. That access never came. By December 2023, something felt fundamentally wrong, and I started paying much closer attention. On January 9th, 2024, I was helping my daughter with a school project that required printing something from our shared home printer, and Ryan's laptop, which he'd left at my house after a family dinner 2 nights earlier, was still logged into his email on our browser. I want to be careful here because I know what this can look like, so let me be precise about what happened. I was not snooping through his private correspondence. I opened the browser to print a document, and the browser auto-populated with a Gmail tab that was already open, displaying an email in his inbox with the subject line, Hearth Logistics Series Seed Pitch Deck V3. Not Hearth Route, Hearth Logistics. I clicked it, and what I found made my stomach drop. It was an email from Ryan to an angel investor named Marcus Webb, dated 3 weeks earlier, describing Hearth Logistics as a company Ryan had founded and built from the ground up, with an attached pitch deck. And that's when I found a smoking gun. The pitch deck was my business plan. Not similar to it, it was my business plan, restructured with new branding, with my 71-page research condensed into 18 slides. My pricing model, reproduced almost exactly. My supplier relationships, listed as exclusive partnerships secured by founder Ryan Cross. My original 3 pilot customers, listed as early customer validation obtained by founder Ryan Cross. There was no mention of me anywhere in the deck. Not as a co-founder, not as a contributor, not as an employee. I did not exist in the document at all. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd built this business, and I read that pitch deck 4 times because I genuinely could not process what I was looking at. Over the following 2 weeks, working carefully, and I'll admit with my hands shaking more than once, I started digging into what else I could find. Here is what I discovered. On November 3rd, 2023, Ryan had filed articles of organization for the Ohio Secretary of State for an LLC called Hearth Logistics LLC, not Hearth Route, Hearth Logistics, listing himself as the sole member. Sole member, not 50%, 100%. He had opened a new business bank account for Hearth Logistics LLC at a different bank than the one I'd wired my $34,000 into. He had approached our original 3 pilot customers and transitioned their contracts from Hearth Route to Hearth Logistics, using language that made it sound like a simple rebrand when in fact it was a completely separate legal entity that I had 0 ownership stake in. He had, as of that January pitch deck, secured a verbal commitment from angel investor Marcus Webb for $150,000 in seed funding, valuing Hearth Logistics at $600,000. I want to pause here and talk about what this actually meant financially, because the emotional betrayal is one thing, but the numbers matter, and I need you to understand the full scope of what was at stake. My original $34,000 capital contribution, gone, with no ownership stake to show for it, since they had gone into an account tied to a business entity. Hearth Route, as a concept, never formally incorporated with me as an owner, that Ryan had effectively abandoned in favor of the new entity he controlled alone. My intellectual property, the business plan, the pricing model, the market research, the supplier relationships I'd spent over a year building, now the exclusive property, in Ryan's telling, of a company I had zero legal claim to. A potential $600,000 valuation built entirely on my work, in which my ownership stake was, as far as any paperwork showed, 0%. And on top of all of it, my brother, the person I trusted with all of this, looking me in the eye at Thanksgiving that year, 6 weeks after he filed those articles of organization, and saying nothing. I confronted Ryan on January 23, 2024. I called him and asked him directly, "Is there a company called Hearth Logistics, and are you the sole owner?" There was a long pause on the phone, and then he said something I will never forget. "Dan, you gave me an idea. I built the business. That's how this works." I told him I wired $34,000 into what he told me was our shared business account. He told me that money had gone toward market research and consulting, and that it was compensated through my role, which he now characterized, for the first time ever, as an unpaid consulting arrangement, not a partnership. I asked him to send me the operating agreement that supposedly outlined this. He said there wasn't one because we never formalized anything. That was the moment I understood exactly what had happened. My brother had spent nearly a year deliberately avoiding any written agreement, not out of naivete, but because the absence of documentation gave him the ability to rewrite our entire history the moment it benefited him. I want to be clear that I did not go straight to a lawyer. I am not a person who wants to sue his own brother. I tried for about 6 weeks to resolve this like adults, like family. I sent Ryan a written proposal on February 2nd, 2024, asking for a 40% ownership stake in Hearth Logistics LLC, less than the 50-50 split we'd originally agreed to verbally, because I was trying to be reasonable and account for the fact that he had, admittedly, done real work on the business development side. I also asked for reimbursement of my $34,000 capital contribution if an ownership stake wasn't something he was willing to formalize. Ryan didn't respond for 11 days. When he finally did, on February 13th, his email offered me $8,000 described as a goodwill gesture for the research assistance I provided, on the condition that I sign an agreement waiving any future claim to Hearth Logistics LLC, its intellectual property, or any future proceeds from the company. $8,000 for a $34,000 capital contribution and over a year of unpaid research and business development work on a company that was, at that point, being pitched to investors at a $600,000 valuation. I did not sign that agreement, and that decision is what started the second half of this story, the part where I stopped being a trusting little brother and started building a case. After Ryan's $8,000 offer, I made a decision that changed the entire trajectory of this story. I stopped trying to resolve this as a family matter, and I started treating it as exactly what it was, a financial and intellectual property dispute that needed to be documented, investigated, and litigated. The first thing I did was consult with an attorney. I want to walk you through exactly how this process worked, because if you're ever in a position where you need to build a legal case against someone who has more information than you, this is the roadmap. On February 20th, 2024, I met with an intellectual property and business litigation attorney named Sarah Voss, who specialized in trade secret misappropriation and partnership disputes. I brought her everything I had: the wire transfer confirmation, the January 9th pitch deck, which I had, importantly, saved and forwarded to my own personal email the moment I found it, a decision my attorney later told me was one of the most important things I did in this entire case: text messages, emails, and a timeline I'd ran out by hand. Sarah told me something that reframed the entire situation for me. She said, "You don't need a signed partnership agreement to prove ownership of intellectual property you created before he was ever involved. What you need is a paper trail showing, 1, that you created this work product independently, 2, that you shared it with him under an understanding of partnership, and 3, that he used it to build a competing entity that excluded you." She explained our potential legal theories. misappropriation of trade secrets under the Defend Trade Secrets Act, a federal law, and Ohio's version of the Uniform Trade Secrets Act. Since my business plan, pricing model, and supplier relationships qualified as trade secrets that I had taken reasonable steps to develop and that had independent economic value. Breach of fiduciary duty. Since even without a written partnership agreement, Ohio law recognizes that when two people agree to jointly pursue a business venture and one contributes money and the other contributes work product, adjudicated recognized partnership is formed. Capital and work product on reliance on that agreement. A fiduciary relationship can be found to exist. Unjust enrichment. A claim that doesn't require a contract at all, just prove that Ryan had received a benefit, my business plan, my capital, my supplier relationships, under circumstances where it would be unfair for him to keep that benefit without compensating me. Fraud, because Ryan had made specific factual misrepresentations, including telling me he'd contributed $40,000 in matching capital, which, as we'll get to, turned out to be false, and telling me the business was structured as a partnership when he knew he was filing paperwork naming himself as sole owner. Over the following 6 weeks, working with Sarah's office and a forensic accountant named Robert Kim, I built out the evidentiary case. This is where the real detective work happened. Robert helped me file a formal request through discovery, once litigation had officially started, for Ryan's bank records related to the original Hearth Route account and the new Hearth Logistics LLC account. This is a legal process, not something you can do on your own. It required a subpoena issued through the court after we filed her complaint. And that's when I found the smoking gun. Again. The bank records showed that Ryan had never wired $40,000 into the original shared account in August 2023, like he told me. He had wired $6,000. That screenshot he'd shown me back in August 2023, the one I hadn't questioned, turned out to be a doctored image, something Robert Kim was able to demonstrate through metadata analysis, showing the image had been edited in an image processing application 3 days before he sent it to me. Let that sink in for a second. My brother had faked a $40,000 wire transfer confirmation to get me to believe he was contributing equal capital to our partnership, when in reality, he put in a sixth of what he claimed, and then using my $34,000 and his $6,000, built a business that he alone owned. The forensic accounting also revealed something else. Between September and December 2023, roughly $11,400 of the original shared account, funded almost entirely by my $34,000 contribution, had been transferred out in increments to what turned out to be Ryan's personal checking account, categorized in his own bookkeeping software as Founder Draw. A Founder Draw, from an account I put $34,000 into, believing I was a co-founder. Because the dollar amounts and the interstate nature of some of the investor communications, Marcus Webb, the angel investor, was based in Illinois, crossed state lines, and because trade secret misappropriation involving interstate commerce can fall under federal jurisdiction, Sarah advised filing our civil complaint in federal courts under the Defend Trade Secrets Act, alongside the state law claims for breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, and unjust enrichment. We filed the civil complaint on April 8, 2024, in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Ohio. Case number, for those of you who want the specifics of how these things are documented, 224CV-01907. Separately, given the evidence of the doctored wire confirmation, which is a form of financial document fraud, Sarah recommended we also file a report with the Ohio Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division and consult with the Federal Trade Commission's complaint database, both to create an additional paper trail, and because doctored financial documents used to induce a business investment can, depending on further findings, rise to the level of criminal wire fraud, which would fall under FBI jurisdiction given the interstate communications involved in the Webb investment discussions. I want to be honest with you, the FBI does not typically prioritize cases at this dollar amount unless there's a broader pattern of fraud, but filing the report mattered for 2 reasons. First, it created an official record. Second, and this became critical later, it meant that when Ryan's attorney eventually learned a federal complaint had been filed alongside a state fraud referral, the calculus around settling this quietly changed dramatically. Here's where the story almost went sideways. In May 2024, about a month after we filed, Ryan's attorney reached out to Sarah with a settlement offer, $22,000 structured as a loan repayment with a non-disparagement clause, and critically, a clause requiring me to state, if ever asked, that Hearth Logistics LLC was solely developed by Ryan. I'll admit, for about 48 hours, I considered it. Litigation is exhausting. It was affecting my relationship with my parents, who didn't understand why the boys couldn't work this out. My wife Claire was the one who talked me through it. She reminded me that Ryan wasn't offering to make me whole. He was offering to buy my silence for less than my original investment while keeping a company that, by that point, had closed a $150,000 Marcus Webb investment and was operating with contracts built entirely on my original supplier relationships. We rejected the offer. Then, in June 2024, we got a break that nearly changed the entire case. During depositions, sworn recorded testimony taken under oath as part of the discovery process, Ryan's own bookkeeper, a contractor named Denise Ashford, whom he'd hired in October 2023 to set up Hearth Logistics LLC's accounting systems, testified that Ryan had told her in an email she still had saved to keep the founding story simple. Just say I built it myself, don't reference my brother's old research. That email, that single sentence from Ryan to his own bookkeeper admitting on paper that there was old research from me that needed to be scrubbed from the founding narrative, became in Sarah's words the single most damaging piece of evidence in this entire case. Ryan's attorney tried to argue the email was taken out of context, that keep it simple was standard startup messaging advice, not an admission of misappropriation. But combined with the doctored wire transfer, the sole member LLC filing 3 weeks after I discovered the pitch deck, and the forensic accounting showing my $34,000 funding the business while he drew personal founder payments from it, the picture was no longer arguable. We were ready for judgment. Facing a federal trade secrets claim with strong documentary evidence, a fraud claim backed by forensic proof of a doctored financial document, and a deposition transcript that read like a confession, Ryan's attorney requested mediation in August 2024. We agreed on the condition that mediation would not delay our ability to proceed to trial if it failed. Mediation took place over 2 sessions in September 2024. I'm not going to pretend it wasn't emotionally brutal, sitting in a room with my brother, our attorneys negotiating dollar figures while Ryan wouldn't make eye contact with me, was one of the hardest things I've done. But I had Sarah, I had Robert's forensic accounting report laid out in black and white, and I had that email to Denise Ashford sitting in the room with us like a loaded gun. And that's when I got the number that made this whole fight worth it. The final settlement, executed on September 19, 2024. Ryan agreed to transfer 45% ownership of Hearth Logistics LLC to me, reflecting my original capital and intellectual property contribution retroactive to the company's formation date. Ryan agreed to a cash payment of $61,500, covering my original $34,000 capital contribution plus damages, minus the $6,000 in legitimate capital he'd actually contributed and could document, structured as a buyout of a portion of my equity stake to allow him to retain majority control if he wished. The company's independent valuation, conducted as part of the settlement process by a neutral business valuation firm both parties agreed to, placed Hearth Logistics LLC's total value at $412,000 as of September 2024, the figure I mentioned at the very beginning of this story. Ryan was also required to issue a corrected founding narrative to Hearth Logistics LLC's investors, including Marcus Webb, formally acknowledging my role in developing the original business plan, pricing model, and supplier relationships, a requirement that frankly mattered to me almost as much as the money. I want to address what justice actually looked like here, because this wasn't a case with handcuffs and a perp walk, and I think it's important to be honest about that. The doctored wire transfer confirmation was referred, as part of our fraud claim documentation, to the Ohio Attorney General's office. As of the most recent update I have, that referral remains under review as a potential case of financial document fraud, which, in Ohio, can be prosecuted as forgery or as a form of theft by deception, depending on the amounts and circumstances involved. I'm not going to speculate on criminal outcomes that haven't happened yet because I think it's important to only tell you what's actually true and documented. What I can tell you is this: Ryan lost sole control of the company he built by cutting me out. He lost 45% of its equity. He paid $61,500 out of pocket. He was legally required to admit in writing to investors that the foundational work behind Hearth Logistics LLC was mine. And within our extended family, the truth of what happened is now known. Not because I told everyone out of spite, but because the settlement documents, the deposition transcript, and the forensic accounting report exist. And eventually, truth has a way of surfacing. Here's something I only learned during the discovery process, and it's the part of the story that changed how I understood everything. I always assumed Ryan cut me out purely out of greed, wanting more of the upside for himself. And that was part of it. But the forensic accounting turned up something else. In the 18 months before Hearth Logistics LLC was formed, Ryan had been carrying roughly $58,000 in credit card debt and the second mortgage he'd taken out on his house without telling his wife, stemming from a previous failed investment in a friend's restaurant franchise in 2021. Ryan wasn't just trying to build a business, he was trying to quietly dig himself out of a financial hole he never told anyone about, using my idea, my research, and my capital. Because he believed, and I think this is the saddest part of the whole story, that if he could just get one big win, he could fix everything before anyone found out how badly he'd mismanaged his own finances. That doesn't excuse what he did. It doesn't come close. But it explains why he was willing to doctor a document and lie to his own brother's face at Thanksgiving. He wasn't the mastermind. He was a desperate man who made a series of choices that, one after another, dug him deeper into fraud he probably never imagined he'd commit when this all started. Today, I hold 45% equity in Hearth Logistics LLC, which has since expanded to serve small specialty food producers across 3 states, with 2025 projected revenue north of $900,000. I'm involved again, this time with a fully executed operating agreement, quarterly financial disclosures, and an independent board observer, because I will never again build something without documentation protecting my ownership stake. Family or not. Ryan and I are not close anymore. We speak occasionally, mostly logistics related to the company we're still, awkwardly, co-owners of. My parents know what happened now. It changed our family, and I won't pretend otherwise. But I got the truth on the record. I got my equity back. I got $61,500 in damages. And most importantly, I never signed that $8,000 waiver he tried to get me to sign back in February 2024. The one that would have erased my entire claim to something I built. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this: document everything, especially with family. The moment someone you trust says, "We don't need to put this in writing," that is the exact moment you insist that you do. Here are the warning signs I wish I'd caught sooner and that I want you to watch for in your own life. 1. A business partner who consistently delays or avoids formalizing ownership agreements even after repeated requests. 2. A partner who starts controlling communication with your suppliers, customers, or investors, cutting you out of conversations you used to be part of. 3. Financial documentation that comes to you as screenshots instead of official bank statements. If someone can't show you an actual statement, that's a red flag, not an inconvenience. 4. Language that shifts from our business to my business in casual conversation. People reveal their real intentions in small, unguarded moments long before they reveal them in a formal confrontation. And 5, and this is the big one, any resistance to a written partnership or operating agreement. In the United States, this document should specify ownership percentages, intellectual property assignment, capital contributions, and what happens if the partnership dissolves. If a partner won't sign one, they are telling you in the clearest possible language what they intend to do later. If you've ever been the victim of financial betrayal by a partner, a family member, a friend, or someone you trusted, I want to hear about it. Tell me what happened in the comments below. Sometimes just writing it down and having other people validate that what happened to you was real and was wrong is the first step toward actually doing something about it. And if this story resonated with you, subscribe, because next week I'm covering a case involving a woman who discovered her financial advisor had been running an unauthorized trading scheme with her retirement account for 6 years, and how a single spreadsheet error is what finally brought the whole thing down. Thank you for watching. Protect your ideas, get it in writing, and never assume trust is a substitute for a signature.